The hum of the jet engines faded into the background as Zuri Calloway settled into her first-class seat. The world outside reduced to a blur of clouds and sky. She adjusted her tailored jacket, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in every room she entered. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle tension crept in, a shift so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less attuned to the nuances of respect and recognition. From the moment she boarded, Zuri sensed a change in the air. The attendant's smile, usually warm and welcoming, felt rehearsed, almost brittle. A brief exchange of glances between crew members, a pause before her greeting was returned, small details, but each one registered. For someone else, these might have been dismissed as quirks of a busy morning. For Zuri, they signaled something deeper, a quiet challenge to her presence in a space she had worked her entire life to access. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the polished wood, the gleaming glassware, the other passengers already lost in their own routines. This was supposed to be a sanctuary, a reward for years of relentless effort, a place where excellence was recognized and comfort was guaranteed. Yet, as the flight climbed higher, so did the sense that her presence was being questioned, her right to comfort subtly undermined. Have you ever found yourself in a place where you were meant to feel valued, only to sense that your very presence unsettled those around you? Have you ever worked twice as hard to reach a level of success, only to be met with hesitation, doubt, or quiet resistance? If so, you know the sting that comes not from open confrontation, but from the slow drip of small slights. Each one a reminder that acceptance can be conditional, even in spaces reserved for the accomplished. Zuri's mind raced through the day ahead, a keynote address at a major tech conference, meetings with industry leaders, the weight of representing not just herself, but every young person who looked up to her as proof that barriers could be broken. Yet, in this moment, at 30,000 feet, the real test was not on a stage or in a boardroom. It was here, in the quiet exchanges and the unspoken rules of first class, that her dignity would be put to the test. What would you do if your sense of self-worth was challenged in a place designed for comfort and recognition? Would you speak up, or would you let it slide, hoping the discomfort would pass? Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed injustice in a placement for comfort? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can shine a light on the moments that too often go unspoken. Zuri Calloway's journey to the top was anything but ordinary. Raised in a neighborhood where opportunity was a rare visitor, she learned early that ambition alone wasn't enough. Resilience, vision, and a refusal to accept limits would be her true allies. Her mother, a community organizer, taught her that leadership meant lifting others as you climbed. Those lessons became the foundation of Zuri's life, shaping her into a woman who saw every challenge as a call to action. By her early 30s, Zuri had transformed Luminatech Solutions from a fledgling startup into a force for change. The company's mission was clear: bridge the digital divide and empower communities that had long been left behind by the tech revolution. Under her guidance, Luminatech didn't just chase profits, it built pathways for young people of color to enter the world of innovation, offering mentorship, scholarships, and a sense of belonging in an industry that often felt closed off. Zuri's reputation grew with every keynote, every partnership, every story of a student who found their voice through technology. She became a symbol of what was possible when talent met opportunity and when someone refused to let the world define their worth. Her days were a blur of board meetings, strategy sessions, and late-night calls with teams across continents. Yet, no matter how high she climbed, she never lost sight of the people she served or the values that anchored her. On this particular morning, as she made her way through San Francisco International Airport, Zuri felt a familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility. The tech conference in New York wasn't just another speaking engagement. It was a chance to share her vision with leaders who could amplify her mission. She carried the hopes of her team, her community, and every young person who saw a piece of themselves in her story. Stepping into the first-class lounge, Zuri was greeted by the quiet luxury that marked these exclusive spaces. Soft lighting, attentive staff, and the gentle clink of fine china created an atmosphere of calm. She moved with ease, her presence commanding respect, her tailored suit a statement of both style and substance. For Zuri, first class was more than a reward. It was a symbol of how far she'd come, a place where her achievements were supposed to be recognized without question. As she boarded the plane, the details of the cabin stood out: wide leather seats, polished metal accents, and a menu curated for discerning travelers. The air carried a faint scent of fresh linen and citrus, a subtle reminder that every detail was designed for comfort. Zuri settled into her seat, her mind already turning to the speech she would deliver, the connection she hoped to forge, and the impact she wanted to leave behind. Yet, beneath the surface, she remained alert. Years of navigating spaces where she was often the only black woman in the room had taught her to read the smallest signals. A pause in conversation, a glance that lingered a moment too long. She knew that luxury could be a double-edged sword, a place of recognition, but also a stage where old prejudices sometimes wore new disguises. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, Zuri allowed herself a moment of pride. She had earned this seat, this view, this moment of quiet before the storm of meetings and expectations. But she also carried an awareness that her presence was a statement in itself. A reminder that excellence knows no boundaries, and that every space, no matter how exclusive, could be transformed by those bold enough to claim it. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Zuri noticed the first shift. It was small, a flight attendant's eyes flickering past her as if searching for someone else, a smile that faded too quickly, a tray set down with a little less care than she'd come to expect. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe the crew was tired. Maybe the morning rush had left everyone a little frayed. She reminded herself not to read too much into it. After all, she'd been here before, both in first class and in moments where her presence seemed to unsettle the status quo. Still, the feeling lingered. As the minutes ticked by, the pattern became harder to ignore. When the attendant returned to offer drinks, Zuri's request for herbal tea was met with a pause, a quick glance at the order sheet, and a nod that felt more like a dismissal than an acknowledgement. The tea arrived lukewarm, the cup set down with a muted thud. Across the aisle, another passenger received a warm greeting, a gentle laugh, and a perfectly prepared cappuccino. The difference was subtle, but it was there. A quiet message that some guests were welcome, while others were merely tolerated. Zuri's mind raced through a familiar checklist. Was she being too sensitive? Was she imagining the slight? She replayed the interactions, searching for any sign that she'd misread the situation. But the evidence kept mounting. The whispered conversation between two crew members as they glanced in her direction, the way her questions were answered with clipped responses, the absence of the easy rapport she'd seen extended to others. She shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. The luxury of the cabin, the soft leather, the gentle hum of conversation, the promise of comfort, suddenly felt less like a reward and more like a test. Every detail, from the way her meal was served to the tone of the attendant's voice, seemed to carry an extra layer of meaning. It was as if her presence had disrupted an unspoken order, and the crew was struggling to recalibrate. Zuri tried to focus on her work, pulling out her tablet and reviewing her notes for the conference. But the tension in the air made it hard to concentrate. She caught herself glancing at the other passengers, searching for a sign that someone else noticed the difference. A woman 2 rows ahead offered a sympathetic smile, a silent gesture of solidarity that said, "I see it too." That small connection gave Zuri a measure of comfort, but it also confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't just in her head. Have you ever found yourself questioning your own perception, wondering if the discomfort you feel is real or just a trick of the mind? Have you ever sat in a room, a meeting, or a space you worked hard to reach, only to sense that your welcome was conditional? These moments can be the hardest to name because they rarely come with open hostility. Instead, they arrive in fragments, a look, a tone, a delay that speaks volumes without a single word. As the flight continued, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Zuri watched as the crew moved through the cabin, their interactions with her marked by a formality that bordered on coldness. Requests were met with sighs, questions with half-answers. The warmth that defined first-class service was reserved for others, while she was left to navigate a landscape of small, persistent slights. She thought of all the times she'd been told to let it go, to avoid making waves, to accept that sometimes people just have bad days. But deep down, she knew this was different. This was not about a single moment, but about a series of choices, each one chipping away at her sense of belonging. If you've ever felt out of place in a space you worked hard to reach, hit the like button. Your experience matters, and acknowledging it is the first step toward change. Zuri took a slow breath, steadying herself. She knew she couldn't control the actions of others, but she could control her response. The question now was how far she was willing to go to defend her dignity, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in a place they'd earned. The herbal tea sat cooling on Zuri's tray, its steam fading as quickly as the warmth in the attendant's voice. She lifted the cup, hoping for comfort, but the tepid liquid only deepened her sense of being overlooked. It was a small thing, easily dismissed by someone who had never been made to feel invisible. For Zuri, though, it was a reminder that even in spaces designed for comfort, respect could be rationed. She considered asking for a fresh cup, but hesitated. Would her request be met with the same indifference? Would it be seen as a reasonable expectation, or as a disruption? The questions circled in her mind, each one heavier than the last. She glanced at the attendant, who was now laughing with a passenger across the aisle, their exchange easy and familiar. The contrast stung. Finally, Zuri pressed the call button. The attendant approached, her expression neutral. "Could I please have a new cup of tea?" "This one's gone cold," Zuri asked, her tone polite but firm. The attendant's response was a clipped, "I'll see what I can do," followed by a quick retreat. No apology, no reassurance. Just a sense that Zuri's request was an inconvenience. Minutes passed. When the tea finally arrived, the attendant set it down with a forced smile. As she turned to leave, Zuri caught a whispered comment to a colleague. "We just need to keep the class peaceful." The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Zuri's heart pounded. The implication was clear: her presence, her request, was somehow a threat to the order of the cabin. A flush of humiliation crept up her neck. She looked around, searching for a friendly face, but most passengers avoided her gaze. A few, however, met her eyes with a look of quiet understanding. One man offered a subtle nod. Another woman gave a sympathetic glance. Their silent support was a balm, but it couldn't erase the sting of being singled out. Zuri's thoughts raced. She replayed the attendant's words, the tone, the timing. Was she being too sensitive? Was she reading too much into a careless remark? But the evidence was mounting, each interaction adding weight to her suspicion. She remembered her mother's advice: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The anger simmered beneath her composure. She had spent her life navigating rooms where she was the only one who looked like her, the only one who carried the weight of representation. Every achievement, every accolade had been hard-won. Yet here she was, in a space she had earned, being made to feel like an outsider. The humiliation was sharper because it was so public. The first-class cabin, with its open layout and attentive service, left little room for privacy. Every exchange was on display, every slight witnessed by an audience of strangers. Zuri felt exposed, her dignity chipped away by a series of small, calculated gestures. She tried to focus on her work, but the words on her tablet blurred. The sense of injustice grew with each passing minute. She thought of the young people who looked up to her, who saw her as proof that success was possible. What message would it send if she stayed silent? What lesson would she teach if she accepted this treatment without protest? Across the aisle, a passenger cleared his throat, drawing the attendant's attention. "Excuse me, could I get some water?" he asked. The attendant responded with a bright smile and a quick refill, her demeanor transformed. Zuri watched the exchange, noting the difference. It wasn't just about service. It was about who was deemed worthy of care. The discomfort in the cabin was growing. Some passengers shifted in their seats, casting furtive glances at Zuri and the crew. A few whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The tension was no longer hidden. It had become part of the atmosphere, impossible to ignore. Zuri's resolve began to take shape. She straightened in her seat, her posture a silent declaration that she would not be diminished. She reminded herself of the battles she had already fought, the barriers she had already broken. This was not the first time she had been tested, and it would not be the last. She decided, in that moment, that she would not let this experience pass without acknowledgement. She would not allow her dignity to be eroded by a series of small, thoughtless acts. Instead, she would use her voice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in a place they had rightfully earned. The flight continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Zuri was no longer just a passenger. She was a witness, an advocate, a leader determined to hold the line. The microaggressions had escalated, but so had her resolve. She would not let this moment define her, but she would make sure it mattered. Zuri sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the second cup of tea untouched. The words, "Keep the class peaceful," echoed in her mind, refusing to fade. She weighed her options, let the moment pass, or address it directly. Years of experience had taught her that silence could be mistaken for acceptance. She pressed the call button again, this time with a sense of purpose. The attendant returned, her expression tight. "Yes?" she asked, voice clipped. Zuri met her gaze, steady and calm. "I'd like to understand the service protocol for first class. I've noticed a difference in how requests are handled. Is there a reason my tea was delayed and served cold, while others received prompt, attentive service?" The attendant's posture stiffened. "We're doing our best to accommodate everyone," she replied, her tone defensive. "If you're unhappy, I can get a supervisor." Zuri nodded. "Yes, I'd appreciate that." The attendant turned on her heel, her movements sharp. Zuri felt the eyes of nearby passengers on her, some curious, others sympathetic. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the sense of unease spreading. A few minutes later, a senior crew member approached. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile practiced. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked, voice low. Zuri explained, her words measured. "I've experienced a series of small slights, delayed service, dismissive responses, and a comment about keeping the class peaceful. I'd like to know how these align with your company's standards for first-class service." The supervisor's smile faltered. She glanced at the attendant, then back at Zuri. "I'm sorry if you feel that way. Our crew is trained to treat all passengers equally." Zuri held her gaze. "Intentions aside, the impact is clear. I expect the same level of respect and care as any other guest." The conversation, though quiet, drew the attention of the entire cabin. Passengers leaned in, their interest piqued by the rising tension. Some exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the shift in atmosphere. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding in a space meant for tranquility. The supervisor attempted to smooth things over. "We value your feedback, and I assure you, we'll look into it. For now, can I offer you something else? Perhaps a different beverage or a meal upgrade?" Zuri shook her head. "This isn't about the tea. It's about being treated with dignity. I'm not asking for special treatment, just fairness." The supervisor hesitated, clearly unprepared for a guest who wouldn't be placated by a token gesture. She offered another apology, this one less convincing than the last. "We'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight." Zuri nodded, but the damage was done. The crew's discomfort was obvious, their movements more cautious, their interactions with her tinged with formality. The other passengers watched, some with admiration, others with unease. A few offered supportive smiles, small gestures of solidarity in a room where silence often reigned. One man, seated a row behind Zuri, caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Another woman, across the aisle, gave a subtle thumbs up. These quiet acknowledgments bolstered Zuri's resolve. She realized she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was giving voice to every person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in a place they had earned. As the supervisor retreated, Zuri felt a wave of emotions, anger, frustration, and a deep sense of responsibility. She thought of the young people who looked up to her, the colleagues who counted on her to lead by example. She remembered her mother's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small in a space you've worked to enter." The humiliation she'd felt earlier was replaced by a quiet determination. She would not let this moment pass without action. She would not allow her dignity to be chipped away by a series of small, thoughtless acts. Instead, she would use her voice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider. Zuri reached for her phone, opening a new note. She began to document every detail, the words exchanged, the tone of voice, the sequence of events. She knew that memory could be unreliable, especially under stress. By recording everything now, she would have a clear account to reference later. She looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of those who had offered support. Their silent encouragement fueled her resolve. She was not alone, even if the crew wanted her to feel isolated. The rest of the flight passed in a tense quiet. The crew avoided unnecessary interaction, their professionalism now edged with caution. Zuri sat tall, her presence a quiet challenge to the status quo. She reviewed her notes for the conference, but her mind kept returning to the incident. She knew that what had happened was bigger than a single cup of tea or a careless remark. It was about the right to be treated with respect, no matter the setting. As the plane began its descent, Zuri made a decision. She would not let this experience be swept under the rug. She would demand accountability. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than in a place they belonged. Her resolve was set. The moment she stepped off the plane, she would take a stand. Not with anger, but with clarity and purpose. She would turn this moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change, using her voice and her platform to demand better, not just for herself, but for all who came after her. As the plane leveled out for the final stretch to New York, Zuri's resolve crystallized. She pressed the call button one last time, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The attendant approached, her face a mask of forced composure. Zuri's voice was steady, her words chosen with care. "I'd like to formally request an apology for the way I've been treated during this flight," she said, her tone even. "I also expect a full investigation into the conduct of the crew. I believe your company values fairness and respect, and I want to see those values upheld." The attendant's eyes widened, caught off guard by the directness of the request. She hesitated, glancing toward the galley as if searching for guidance. I'll let the supervisor know," she stammered, her confidence faltering. Within minutes, the senior crew member returned, her demeanor more guarded than before. "Miss Calloway, I understand you have concerns. We take all feedback seriously. I can assure you, we'll file a report and follow up with you after landing." Zuri nodded, her expression unwavering. "I expect to be contacted directly. I also want to know what steps will be taken to address this, not just for me, but for any passenger who finds themselves in a similar situation." The supervisor's response was careful, almost rehearsed. "Of course, we'll make sure your concerns are documented." She offered a thin smile, but the tension in her posture betrayed her discomfort. The conversation ended, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. The crew moved with a new wariness, their interactions with Zuri now tinged with apprehension. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in first class grew heavier. Conversations quieted, and the usual hum of polite chatter faded. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange now watched Zuri with a mix of admiration and empathy. Some offered small gestures. A nod, a reassuring glance, a whispered word of encouragement as they passed by on their way to the restroom. These silent signals spoke volumes, affirming that Zuri's stand was not just her own. Zuri felt the weight of their eyes, the unspoken hope that she would not back down. She thought of the countless times she'd been the only black woman in a room, the only one expected to carry the burden of representation. This moment was no different. She was aware that her actions would ripple far beyond the confines of this flight. Every word, every decision would be scrutinized, not just by the airline, but by those who looked to her as a model of strength and integrity. She remembered the stories she'd heard from friends and colleagues, stories of being overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. She thought of the young people who followed her journey, who saw her as proof that success was possible, that dignity could be claimed and defended. The responsibility was immense, but it was one she accepted willingly. The crew, meanwhile, seemed unsure how to proceed. Their movements were careful, their words measured. The usual rhythm of service had been disrupted, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. Zuri could sense their discomfort, but she refused to let it sway her. She had not raised her voice, had not resorted to anger or accusation. Her demand was simple: respect, accountability, and a commitment to do better. As the plane began its descent, Zuri took a moment to reflect. She had not planned for this confrontation, but she knew it was necessary. Too often, moments like these were brushed aside, dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. She was determined that this would not be one of those times. She glanced around the cabin one last time, meeting the eyes of those who had silently supported her. Their presence gave her strength. She realized that her stand was not just about her own experience, but about setting a precedent for everyone who would come after her. The wheels touched down, and the plane taxied to the gate. Zuri gathered her belongings, her posture unyielding. She was ready for whatever came next. Ready to hold the airline accountable, ready to speak her truth, and ready to ensure that dignity would not be negotiable. In that moment, Zuri understood the true meaning of leadership. It was not just about personal achievement or recognition. It was about using one's voice, one's platform, to demand better, not just for oneself, but for all who had ever been made to feel small in a place they belonged. Her resistance was quiet, but it was powerful. A reminder that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away. As the plane began its descent toward JFK, Zuri's mind replayed every detail of the flight. She cataloged each moment: the delayed tea, the clipped responses, the whispered remark about keeping the class peaceful. Every slight was etched into her memory, not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern that demanded acknowledgement. She felt the familiar ache of exhaustion that came from having to prove her worth in spaces where her presence was still questioned. The city skyline came into view, a reminder of the world waiting beyond the cabin. Zuri straightened her jacket, her resolve hardening. She would not let this experience fade into the background. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, she reached for her phone, her hand steady. Before the seatbelt sign was even off, Zuri began documenting her experience. She opened her notes app and typed a clear, chronological account of the events, every interaction, every word, every look that had made her feel less than welcome. She included the names of the crew members, the time of each exchange, and the reactions of those around her. She knew that details mattered, especially when challenging a system that often relied on ambiguity to avoid accountability. As passengers gathered their belongings, Zuri quietly approached those who had offered her silent support during the flight. She introduced herself, explained her intention to file a formal complaint, and asked if they would be willing to share what they had witnessed. Several agreed, offering their contact information and brief statements. Their willingness to stand with her, even in a small way, reinforced her belief that change was possible when people refused to look away. With her documentation complete and witness statements secured, Zuri composed a message for her social media followers. She chose her words carefully, balancing honesty with restraint. She described the series of microaggressions, the impact on her sense of dignity, and her decision to demand accountability. She encouraged others to share their own stories, to speak up when faced with injustice, and to support one another in the pursuit of respect. Within minutes of posting, Zuri's story began to spread. Comments poured in, some from strangers who had experienced similar treatment, others from colleagues and friends expressing outrage and support. The post was shared, retweeted, and picked up by influencers who amplified her message. Hashtags calling for accountability trended across platforms, and screenshots of her account circulated widely. News outlets quickly took notice. Headlines appeared online. Black CEO denied first-class service. Airline faces backlash after discrimination allegations. Luxury flight sparks national conversation on bias. Journalists reached out for interviews, eager to hear Zuri's perspective and to understand how such an incident could occur in a setting designed for comfort and exclusivity. The airline's corporate office was caught off guard by the speed and scale of the response. Executives convened emergency meetings, scrambling to assess the situation and craft a public statement. The company's social media team issued a brief apology, promising a thorough investigation and a commitment to upholding the highest standards of service. But the public was not satisfied with platitudes. People demanded transparency, accountability, and real change. Behind the scenes, the airline's leadership reached out to Zuri directly. A representative met her at the gate, offering a formal apology and assurances that her complaint would be taken seriously. Zuri listened, her demeanor calm but resolute. She reiterated her expectations, a full investigation, consequences for those responsible, and a review of the company's training and policies to prevent future incidents. As she left the airport, Zuri felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. She knew the fight was far from over. The story had become bigger than her own experience. It was now part of a larger movement demanding dignity and respect for all. She took comfort in the messages of support, the solidarity of strangers, and the knowledge that her decision to speak out had already begun to make a difference. In the hours that followed, the story continued to gain traction. Television anchors debated the implications, advocacy groups issued statements, and other travelers came forward with their own accounts of bias in elite spaces. The airline's reputation hung in the balance, and the pressure to respond with more than words grew by the hour. Zuri watched the coverage from her hotel room, her phone buzzing with notifications. She felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The events of the day had been draining, but they had also sparked a necessary conversation. She knew that real change would require persistence, courage, and the willingness to hold powerful institutions accountable. As night fell over the city, Zuri allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a call for justice, and in doing so, had given voice to countless others who had been made to feel invisible. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The morning after her story swept across social media, Zuri received a call from the airline's executive office. They requested a private meeting at their New York headquarters, eager to address the situation before it spiraled further. Zuri agreed, determined to ensure the conversation would be more than a formality. She arrived at the glass-walled conference room, greeted by a team of senior executives and legal counsel. Their faces were a blend of concern and calculation, aware that the eyes of the public were now fixed on every move they made. Zuri took her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding attention without a word. The airline spokesperson began with a carefully worded apology, expressing regret for her experience and promising a thorough review. Zuri listened, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she spoke with clarity and conviction. "I appreciate your apology, but words alone are not enough. I expect a full investigation into the conduct of your crew, immediate suspension of those involved, and a transparent review of your service protocols. This is not just about my experience. It's about ensuring that no passenger is ever made to feel unwelcome or diminished on your flights." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. One attempted to reassure her, suggesting that a review would be conducted and appropriate action taken. Zuri held firm. "I'm not here for vague promises. I want to see real accountability. The crew should be suspended pending the outcome of your investigation, and your company must commit to meaningful changes in training and oversight." Her words left no room for negotiation. The room fell silent, the weight of her demands settling over the table. Zuri's reputation as a leader who championed justice and equity gave her leverage few others could claim. She was not just a dissatisfied customer. She was a public figure whose voice carried influence far beyond the walls of this boardroom. The executives recognized the gravity of the moment. They understood that failing to act decisively would not only damage their brand, but also signal to the world that they were unwilling to confront bias within their ranks. After a brief, hushed discussion, the CEO of the airline addressed Zuri directly. "We hear you, Ms. Calloway. Effective immediately, the crew from your flight will be suspended while we conduct a full investigation. We will also initiate a comprehensive review of our service standards and anti-discrimination training. Your experience has highlighted areas where we must do better, and we are committed to making those changes." Zuri nodded, her expression resolute. She had not raised her voice or threatened legal action. Her authority came from her unwavering insistence on fairness and her willingness to hold those in power accountable. The executives promised to keep her informed at every stage of the process and to share the results of their investigation with the public. As she left the meeting, Zuri felt a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The airline's decision to suspend the crew was unprecedented, a clear signal that the era of quiet tolerance for bias was ending. News of the suspension spread quickly, drawing praise from advocacy groups and sparking conversations across the industry. Zuri's influence as a CEO and advocate for justice had forced a powerful institution to confront its shortcomings. Her actions set a new standard for accountability, proving that one person's refusal to accept injustice could drive real, lasting change. The world was watching, and Zuri had shown what was possible when courage met conviction. The news of the crew's suspension sent shockwaves through social media. Zuri's story, already trending, now became a rallying point for thousands who had experienced similar treatment in spaces meant for comfort and recognition. Comments flooded in from every corner, some sharing their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed, others expressing gratitude for Zuri's courage to speak out. Testimonies poured in, not just from travelers, but from employees in hospitality, tech, and other industries where bias often hides behind polite smiles. People described moments when they, too, had been made to feel like outsiders despite their achievements. The comment sections became a living archive of shared struggle and solidarity, each post adding to the momentum for change. Public figures joined the conversation. Activists, journalists, and celebrities used their platforms to amplify Zuri's message. Some recounted their own experiences, while others called on companies to examine their practices and commit to real reform. News outlets ran in-depth segments, inviting experts to discuss the subtle ways discrimination can persist even in the most exclusive environments. Zuri's inbox filled with messages from strangers and supporters. Some thanked her for her bravery, others asked for advice on how to address injustice in their own workplaces. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also made clear that her story was not an isolated incident, It was part of a much larger pattern that demanded attention. The airline, under intense scrutiny, moved quickly to announce a series of reforms. They introduced new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and customer care, developed in partnership with diversity experts. A transparent feedback system was launched, allowing passengers to report concerns directly to senior management. The company also committed to regular audits of service quality, with results made public to ensure accountability. Other airlines took notice. Within weeks, several major carriers announced their own reviews of service protocols and staff training. Industry publications highlighted the changes, noting that Zuri's stand had set a new benchmark for how companies should respond to discrimination. The ripple effect extended beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, and even tech firms began to re-examine their own policies, inspired by the public's demand for dignity and fairness. Zuri's influence grew as invitations arrived from conferences, universities, and advocacy groups. She was asked to speak on panels about leadership, equity, and the power of individual action. At each event, she shared her story, not as a tale of personal hardship, but as a call to action for those in positions of authority. Her message to other leaders was clear. It's not enough to have policies on paper. True change requires vigilance, humility, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Every organization, no matter how prestigious, must be willing to listen, learn, and act. Zuri's words resonated far beyond the boardroom. She became a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to accept the status quo. Her story was cited in business schools, discussed in leadership seminars, and referenced in articles about corporate responsibility. The impact was undeniable. One person's insistence on respect had sparked a movement that reached across industries and communities. As the weeks passed, Zuri remained grounded in her mission. She continued to mentor young professionals, reminding them that their voices mattered and that their presence in elite spaces was not a privilege, but a right. The ripple effect of her actions continued to spread, proving that real change begins when someone is willing to stand up and demand it. In the quiet of her hotel room, away from the glare of headlines and the constant ping of notifications, Zuri finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the past days. The pain was real, a deep ache that came from being reduced to a stereotype in a space she had worked so hard to enter. She replayed the moments on the flight, the sting of being dismissed, the effort it took to remain composed, and the exhaustion that followed every public stand. Yet, beneath the pain, there was pride. Pride in her refusal to shrink, pride in the way she had carried herself, and pride in the knowledge that her actions had sparked a conversation much bigger than herself. She thought of her mother, whose voice still echoed in her mind. Respect is not just given, it's demanded by the truth you carry within. Those words had shaped Zuri's approach to every challenge, reminding her that dignity was not negotiable, no matter the setting. Memories of her childhood surfaced. Her mother organizing neighborhood meetings, teaching her to speak up for what was right, and showing her that leadership was about service, not status. Those early lessons had become the foundation of Zuri's strength. They reminded her that every act of resistance, no matter how small, could plant the seeds of change. Returning to Luminatech, Zuri brought with her a renewed sense of purpose. She called her team together, not to discuss quarterly targets or product launches, but to talk about values. She shared her experience openly, inviting others to reflect on their own encounters with bias and exclusion. The conversation was raw and honest, sparking a wave of stories from employees who had faced similar challenges in their own lives. This openness transformed the company's culture. Team members felt empowered to speak up, to challenge assumptions, and to support one another in ways that went beyond the workplace. Diversity and inclusion were no longer just words in a handbook. They became living principles, woven into every decision and every interaction. Zuri's experience on the flight became a touchstone for Luminatech's mission. The company doubled down on its commitment to creating opportunities for those who had been left out of the tech revolution. New mentorship programs were launched, partnerships with community organizations deepened, and a renewed focus on equity shaped every project. Through it all, Zuri remained visible and accessible, reminding her team that leadership was about more than titles or accolades. It was about using every challenge as a catalyst for growth, and every setback as a lesson in resilience. The pain of her experience had not faded, but it had been transformed into pride, into purpose, and into a deeper resolve to make sure that no one in her company or her community would ever have to face such indignity alone. The aftermath of Zuri's flight did not end with public apologies or policy changes. As the story continued to circulate, civil rights organizations reached out, urging her to pursue a formal complaint. Zuri agreed, knowing that real accountability often required more than promises. It demanded action in the courts as well as the court of public opinion. The legal process was rigorous. Zuri worked closely with her legal team, gathering evidence and compiling the detailed notes she had taken immediately after the flight. Witnesses from the cabin provided statements, describing what they had seen and heard. The airline, now under the scrutiny of both regulators and the public, was compelled to cooperate fully. When the day came for Zuri to testify, she approached the witness stand with the same composure she had shown throughout the ordeal. Her account was clear and precise. She described each interaction, the tone of the crew, and the cumulative effect of the microaggressions she endured. She spoke not only for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in a place they had earned. Her testimony resonated in the courtroom. The judge and jury listened as she explained how subtle acts of bias could erode a person's sense of belonging, even in the most exclusive settings. Zuri's words gave voice to a reality that many had experienced, but few had been able to articulate so powerfully. The outcome of the case set a new standard. The court found that the airline's actions, while not overtly hostile, had created an environment where a paying customer was denied the respect and service she was entitled to. The ruling required the airline to implement stricter anti-discrimination protocols, regular staff training, and a transparent process for handling complaints. This decision sent a message far beyond the airline industry. High-profile clients, often assumed to be immune from such treatment, now had a legal precedent to reference. Companies across sectors began to review their own practices, recognizing that reputation alone was not enough to shield them from accountability. Advocacy groups celebrated the verdict, calling it a turning point in the fight for equity in luxury and professional spaces. Media outlets covered the story as a landmark moment, highlighting how one person's insistence on dignity could drive institutional change. Zuri's case became a reference point in legal seminars and business ethics courses. It was cited in articles and policy discussions as an example of how the law could be used to challenge not just individual acts of bias, but the systems that allowed them to persist. The broader implication was clear: no matter how subtle, discrimination would not be tolerated, and those with the courage to speak out could reshape the standards for everyone. Months after the incident, the airline's transformation was unmistakable. New training programs became standard for every employee, with a focus on empathy, cultural awareness, and the importance of treating every passenger with respect. Feedback from travelers showed a marked improvement in service, and the company's leadership made a point of sharing progress reports with the public. Other airlines followed suit, eager to avoid similar missteps and to show their commitment to fairness. The ripple effect reached far beyond aviation. Luxury hotels, tech firms, and even financial institutions began to review their own policies, inspired by the public's demand for accountability. Zuri's story was cited in industry conferences and business journals as a turning point, a moment when a single act of resistance forced an entire sector to rethink its values. Zuri's influence only grew. She was invited to speak at universities, leadership summits, and community events. Her message was consistent. True leadership is measured not by titles or accolades, but by the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. She continued to mentor young professionals, encouraging them to claim their space and to use their voices to challenge injustice wherever they found it. One afternoon, at a tech symposium, a young coder approached Zuri. Nervous but determined, she shared how Zuri's story had changed her outlook. "I always felt like I didn't belong in rooms like this," she admitted. "But seeing you stand up for yourself, and for all of us, showed me that I have a right to be here, too." Zuri smiled, recognizing a familiar spark in the young woman's eyes. She offered encouragement, reminding her that every act of courage, no matter how small, could open doors for others. The exchange was brief, but it captured the essence of Zuri's legacy, inspiring others to believe in their own worth and to demand the respect they deserved. As the years passed, Zuri's story became a touchstone for conversations about equity and leadership. Her actions on that flight were remembered not just for the immediate changes they brought, but for the way they challenged an entire industry to do better. She had shown that dignity was not a privilege, but a right, and that leadership meant having the courage to demand it for everyone. Leadership is the courage to demand dignity for all. Zuri's journey proved that one person's stand could spark a movement, and that the fight for respect and fairness is never truly finished. If Zuri's story inspired you, subscribe for more powerful stories and share this video to keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a world where dignity is never in question. Zuri Calloway's flight was more than just a journey from one city to another. It became a powerful reminder that injustice can appear in unexpected places, and that the courage to confront it can reshape an industry and even a society. Her dignified stand in the face of subtle prejudice not only led to tangible changes in airline practices, but also ignited a broader conversation about respect, inclusion, and accountability. Her story, woven from threads of personal strength and professional triumph, stands as a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of demanding dignity in every sphere of life. Zuri's journey continues to inspire, reminding us that the true measure of leadership is not solely in achieving success, but in ensuring that success is shared, respected, and made accessible to all. In that spirit, every challenge she faced, every slight she endured, has now become a stepping stone toward a future where discrimination is met not with silence, but with a resounding call for justice and profound change. Now, we turn to you. What would you have done in Zuri's place? How have you navigated moments where your dignity was challenged? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your insights add to this vital conversation. And if Zuri's story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Echoes of Grace for more powerful stories that inspire, educate, and empower. Together, we can amplify these echoes of truth and build a more just world.